people would allow this to happen, and it's very informative to us. So I want you to turn over to chapter 6, and this is still within the context of all this, and we'll kind of demonstrate that a little bit. Chapter 6, verse 12 and 13. Now, what's going on in chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, is Paul is reciting a quote from their philosophical mindset, and then responding. And then another quote, and then responding. It happens 3 times. Read this in verse 12. All things are lawful for me. Now, Paul's not saying that. They're saying that. All things are lawful for me. And you could see Paul saying that in a little bit. You know, you think about Galatians and some of the things that have to do with the law and the Spirit and all that. But they've taken this to extreme. All things are lawful for me. Then he says, not all things are helpful. That's Paul's response. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. What he has going on here is a mini debate with the worldly wisdom and the philosophical concepts that have gotten into the Corinthian church. What they have done is they have set up an intellectual framework that some accepted based on this kind of thinking. And while they personally might not have thought that this fornication was okay, it allowed them to justify it. Because I've got this way of thinking, the logical extreme of this way of thinking, I can't really say much about it. And so they were allowing this kind of immorality going on because their heads were messed up. It wasn't just, they're just completely immoral pagan people. Some people read the letter to the Corinthians and like, oh, they're just a bunch of pagans and heathens and all that. But Paul had spent 18 months there teaching. There were Jewish Christians there. They knew the truth. And what was happening is they had let the culture and the mindset of their philosophy of the day to enter in their thinking. So you go from holy horror, now you should have a different kind of horror. And that is, it's possible for good people to get their thinking so messed up, they can miss something like this. There was, as I was entering into the workforce, I was confronted with people living together. They would keep it quiet. They would likely, not want people to know about it. They might even kind of recognize it was wrong, but they want to do it anyway. Today, the thinking is such that we have converted people's minds to a philosophy and a culture that's not even wrong. And that's true across a broad spectrum of things, many of which we'll hit as we go through the book of 1 Corinthians. It is possible to become so intellectually corrupt that you can change evil into good. And that's what's happened here in Corinth. So yes, do react in holy horror when you read these first 2 verses, right? But do it for the right reason. It's holy horror, recognizing that a mind can become so corrupt to allow things. This isn't just people saying, oh, I just want to do what I want to do. They had justified allowing them to do what they wanted to do on some twisted form of a biblical principle. And that's part of the issues that you have in Corinth. So let's go back and read this text, verses 1 through 8. It's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans. For a man has his father's wife, and you are arrogant, oh, you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. For though absent in body, I am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment on the one who did such a thing. When you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present with the power of our Lord Jesus, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now notice that 3 times in this text it has the phrase among you. It's talking about the congregation in Corinth. And in fact, there's an illustration in the middle about leavened and unleavened that is all about among you. And we'll have some more to say about that in a moment. But the discussion here is about a Christian in the congregation in Corinth. So we need to have that firmly planted in our mind. It says in verse 2 that you are arrogant. Now, he talked about some arrogance earlier, chapter 4, pride and some of those kinds of things generally. But I suspect, given the context and things that he has to say, that they were arrogant about this very thing. Meaning that we have so aligned our intellectual thinking and our arguments correctly that we even allow this because it fits the model. And Paul's looking at that and saying, you've completely lost your mind. You not only allowed this to happen, you're prideful about the fact that you intellectually approve of it. Now, by the way, if you look at our current culture, that's exactly what's going on in our current culture on a number of topics. But that's what was happening in Corinth. And so they had this worldly wisdom mixed with Bible when they were coming to these conclusions, and they, in fact, were proud of it. So he says he wants this person removed from among you. And we'll talk a little bit about disfellowship in a minute, but that's really what it's talking about. He says, I'm absent in body, but I'm present in spirit. This is a congregational issue. It's a local issue. And really, Paul is saying, now, I don't want you to think of me as being someplace else and having this view of what's going on. I want you to recognize that I am with you in the congregation, and this congregational action needs to happen in this, and that's why he says, I'm present in spirit. He says, I've already pronounced judgment. Talk a little bit about judging later, but there are times to pronounce judgment, right? And this is a case where judgment needed to be pronounced. So he says, when you're assembled, that's the congregation, in the name of the Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present, because it's a local thing, is present, with the power of our Lord Jesus, deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Now, flesh there is not the normal word for body. We're not talking about physical harm here. By the way, there have been religious groups over the years that have treated this as something that should be physical harm. That's not what's being talked about here. It's a different word altogether. It has to do with sensuous desires, and that is what needs to be destroyed in this particular individual. And then he says, delivered to Satan. Basically, there's only 2 categories. In the body or in Satan. And what needs to happen with this person is they need to recognize they're not in the body, they're in Satan. And when they recognize they're in Satan, perhaps with love and care and concern of the right type, they will come to their senses so that they can be returned to being back in the body. Right now, what they think they are is they think they're in the body doing this. And the point needs to be made clear, you can't be in the body and do this. Those things, 2 things do not go together. And the reason for it is laid out very much, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. The only reason that this action is going to happen is for, or at least a reason, is for the benefit of him. It's also for the benefit of the church, but for the benefit of him, not to punish him or anything like that, but that the end goal is that he might be saved, restored back into the body. Verse 6, he says, your boasting is not good. Their arrogance in this thing. And then he uses the illustration about leaven and leaven the whole lump. This is Old Testament illustration from the Passover. We understand yeast. If you don't understand exactly the word leaven, you get a little bit of yeast and dough. It changes its nature. It goes through the whole thing. You can use all kinds of illustrations. You put a rotten apple in a barrel of apples, what happens? They all go rotten. It's the point of now you're not only worried about him, you're also worried about the congregation itself. And that if this is going on, it hurts him, it has the potential to spread throughout the congregation, and it's not discussed here, but it also has the potential to destroy your influence in the community. All three of those things are going on with this kind of action is happening within the church. And so he says to reduce it to being serving with the unleavened bread or not having the bad apple, whatever you might use as your illustration, in sincerity and truth. Now, this is one of the texts that talks about the practice of disfellowship. So this is the action within a congregation when they have to deal with either deep moral or false teaching issues that have to be addressed. There's other texts, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 6. There's a discussion there where Paul talks about to withdraw fellowship from the one who's walking disorderly, not according to the commands that we've given you. You can go to Matthew chapter 18, the story of if a brother offends you, then you go to another brother, and then you take it to church, same kind of thing, the principles of disfellowship. Disfellowship is not practiced much in our society. And I think there's a reason it's not practiced, and it's not that we don't want to. It's more of an issue of we don't actually have fellowship. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. In their society, and in certain societies, the church was their whole life. 80-90% of their friendships, time with others, etc., was spent with the church. This was true in the synagogue, in the Jewish context. It has been true at times in the church. The intent of fellowship and disfellowship is to have a feeling of loss. A feeling of loss. Now, here's generally what happens today. Someone's a member of the church, and they're living in some way that's wrong. Elder talks to them, preacher talks to them. You never see them again. They're gone. That's what happens, right? They didn't feel any sense of loss at all. By the way, you can't disfellowship when there's no fellowship. So part of this is, everybody gets all excited. Well, we're not conducting disfellowship in our church. No, we're not conducting fellowship. That's the issue. And I think all of us sort of need to think about who our acquaintances are, where we spend our time. And this is not biblical, this is Brett, but if 80-90% of your friends aren't members of the church and that's not who you spend the most of your time with, you don't understand fellowship, because that's the way it's supposed to be. And that's for their well-being, and oh, by the way, for your own. So that if someone does need to correct you or correct me, there's some fear of, wait a minute, this is my very close family and they're upset with me. That doesn't happen today. Certainly not in our particular location. It's very rare to see that. So it's very, very difficult for us to carry out this fellowship because, in fact, there's not fellowship. Now, one other thing that should be very important and noticed here is the word among you. I mentioned that. It's been a while, but you used to have people that they would cleanse the rolls, right? I haven't seen anybody for 6 months or a year that I've literally seen this. They'd stand up front, read their names, and say they're no longer part of this. We're disfellowshipping them. That's ridiculous, because you can't disfellowship if there's no fellowship in the first place, right? This is intended for when someone is an active, engaged member of your congregation and they're having moral failings or they're teaching false teaching and they're in the wrong place and they could hurt others. That's what this is about, not cleansing the rolls or something like that. So that's the perspective I have on disfellowship. But I do think we all, and myself included, need to think about creating fellowship and how you do that. Not so we can disfellowship, but frankly, I think we miss a lot in that because we may not see each other except for on Sundays and Wednesdays, and I know that's different for others, but Really think about who your circle of friends are, where you spend your time. Enjoy the blessing of fellowship, because I think we miss that some. All right, I suspect there's a question or two about this. Let me stop there. What comments or questions do you have? Gary?
I just want to make a comment. I was over in Nigeria years ago, and the doctor over this hospital said, I want to get you in the morning and walk through this village. And I went with him. And I don't remember, 4:30 or something. We were walking, and he's talking, and we're headed to this little village. And I'm looking for viper, It's not walking through this brush. And we get to the little place, and I wasn't expecting this. And I mean, there was a covering, whole congregation of people. They not only worship, but then after they worship, they actually called a roll to mark who's there. They did that every single day.
Yeah, yeah.
What if I went home and did that?
You would call a roll every time. I bet they can't even get people to check in here, so it's a good point. Yeah, called up yonder. Yes, sir.
In verse 2, you're talking about the fact that they said that we're arrogant. NIV says proud.
Proud.
I have a side note on mine that talks about the fact that they were tolerant. Maybe they're accepting.
Yeah.
That sure sounds a lot like society today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, he said that he's got a note in his Bible that said, it's got proud in verse 2, tolerant, some of those kinds of things. That's today's society. I mean, the number of people, and, we can pick a particular topic, but the number of people that are actively practicing homosexuality is a relatively small percentage. But the number of people who think they are intellectual giants because they're accepting of it is sky high. And that's the pride that he's talking about here. So, very much so. If you're engaged in corporate world at all, you understand this, and this is a big deal. Terry?
I think also, though, the fact that this thing goes through this fellowship process, that person that's being dismissed has got to feel the loss.
Yeah, they have to feel the loss.
When you're in Nashville, when you have a church in every corner, they just going to be going down the road.
Yeah, and I mean, and I don't have the answer for that because that's a difficult issue, and it's a lot of things. But I do recognize we don't have the kind of fellowship that they had. Again, a small town is a lot easier than a big city on some of these things, right? So, but yeah, you're right. You can't disfellowship if there's not fellowship that would create loss. It does you no good. Now, let me make a big distinction. Because I do think we can and should do this. In Romans chapter 16, verse 17, it says, to mark those who cause divisions among you. That is not talking about, per se, inside the congregation. It's a warning that says, watch out, watch out. And this is for the protection of the congregation. There are times, and this is particularly around false teaching, where the congregation needs to be warned and say, hey, this may look good, but it's a problem. When I was an elder at Gold Hill many years ago, I don't know if you remember Promise Keepers, but Promise Keepers came to town. They were doing a big deal. We didn't do this very often, but we got up and said to the men of the congregation, watch out, don't go, and here's why. And that's a sort of marking that says you need to be careful. It looks good, but here's a problem with it. And so that's different than disfellowship, I think, because that's really saying there is a false teaching here or a problem here that should be done. Now, some take that to extreme. They run around all over the country and they just write up things about everybody that's wrong. No, you need to worry about your congregation. And if there's an actual risk to your congregation, then of course address it because you're a shepherd of the flock or you're caring for your flock. But you don't need to be going around marking heretics everywhere, which is sometimes that's people's hobby as well. So, all right. Let's go on now, beginning with verse 9. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of a brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. Now, evidently, even though the church had only been there 2 or 3 years at this point, Paul had already written them a letter. And we don't have that letter, but it was perhaps it was just a short letter. He had heard some things, and perhaps he had laid it out. But whatever it says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. He wants to clarify. He wanted to be sure that they understood what he meant by that, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world. They must have misunderstood, or maybe they did not have the clarity of understanding that he's really talking about keeping the church pure, not about trying to keep the world pure. Now, I'll tell you, this is pretty important for us, because notice it says in here, what have I to do with judging outsiders? My observation in our American experience, we spend a lot of time working on judging the outsiders. We spend a lot of time talking about what our politicians are doing that impacts morality. We spend a lot of time talking about, what celebrity did this or who did that, or lamenting all those things. What Paul's saying is our priority is purity in here. That's where the focus needs to be. One of my Facebook friends, he's Edwin Jones, well-known preacher, been around a long time. He wrote, and this was satire, I'm tired of the endless political wrangling about Nero and morality. And what he really means by that is what everybody in the church is talking about is those people out there. Paul's saying that's not the problem. The problem is to make sure you stay pure on the inside. Now, here's what's going on. We, those of us that are at least my age and older, grew up in a time where Judeo-Christian values were the way the world worked. They were in our government. They were everywhere. And so we are used to a society out there that's aligned, at least in some ways, with what's going on in here. Now, there may have been sin, but it's quiet sin. There was divorce, people were embarrassed by it. Those kinds of things were happening, but they were recognized for what they were. We're in a society that now has moved against that, completely gone. And we're offended by that. And so we get all riled up about what's going on out there. Now, I can tell you, while the world now is really bad, it was a whole lot worse than Nero's day. It was a whole lot more corrupt. It was the last few verses of Romans chapter 1, if you want to read that sometime. That's where Paul lived. And Paul didn't spend any time talking about all those people out there. Bring them the gospel. When they're on the inside, that's where we need to focus. And so he says here, I'm not talking about this. Paul was a tent maker. He sold tents. Do you think he only sold tents to Christians? You think he might have sold tents to people that what was going on inside those tents he wouldn't approved of? See, he wasn't worried about what was going on out there. He's worried about what's going on here. And I think it's really hard for us because we're hurt and we're offended as citizens, and certainly we should vote around these things. I get all that. But that's not the biblical focus first. The biblical focus first is maintaining purity on the inside. And so he goes through this and says, don't worry as much about people out there, worry about on the inside. And then he concludes it by saying, purge the evil person from among you. He talks here about judging. The Bible talks about judging in different ways. There's certainly the phrase, judge not, right? Or don't judge before the time. This on the Sermon on the Mount. What that means always is unfair judgment. This is the beam in your own eye before you go after the speck on the other. As Marshall Keeble used to say, we don't judge, we do fruit inspection, right? So fruit inspection is a good thing, right? That's right and it's appropriate. But Paul is saying, where does the fruit inspection happen? Inside the church. The other way that judging is used is in Romans chapter 14, in matters that relate to opinion. And we won't spend a lot of time on that, but you and I can come up and I can talk to you, I could probably find some things opinion-wise we disagree on. It might not take too long at all, right? But don't judge each other on those things. The only thing that we should be judging each other things on are the black and white doctrinal issues of Scripture, rather than a variety of things that people get upset about. So he spends some time here talking about judging. So important for us to think about that. Comments, thoughts on this? All right, that takes us into chapter 6. Now, it's interesting that he's going to spend some time here about Christians suing each other. Well, how in the world do you go from a discussion of sexual immorality and then jump to a discussion about Christians suing each other? Well, it's because judging. The foundation of this is judging, and the judging that Christians should be involved in, and the judging that Christians should not be involved in. And that's the natural flow that goes into this. He's going to go on towards the end of chapter 6 and pick up the topic of sexual immorality again, and then on into marriage. But here, while I'm dealing with judging, I've heard about this. And so I want to talk about this particular issue. So chapter 6, beginning with verse 1. When one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? If the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more than matters pertaining to this life? So if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? But you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brothers. All right, so evidently there are one or more instances where there were civil proceedings going on between members of the church. And so we might say one member of the church sued another member of the church, and then they went to the courts to get this worked out. It's bizarre as we think about that, but we can relate to that. We can see how that might could happen. Now, he makes the point here about going back to judging is, don't you know that the church is going to judge the world? Don't you know that the church is going to judge angels? Now, I have a lot of questions about all that, and I have no answers about all that. Obviously there's a thing in Daniel that talks about that. Matthew 19 mentions that, talking to the apostles, that they would sit on 12 thrones and judge. Revelation, there's 3 or 4 references to the saints judging the world. And so I don't know everything that needs to be known about that. It's not revealed to us. But if Paul said it, it's true, and I believe it. And in some way, Christians in the next life will be involved in judging the world and judging angels. And so his obvious point is from the major to the minor. If you're going to be doing that, do you think maybe you could handle a little financial dispute among members of the church that's not going to have any life to it at all in eternity? Have some sense here. You're going to do some judging. Why don't you do some judging here? Because there's an opportunity here for you to add value and make things work the way they should work. And so he says, I say it to your shame, can it be there's no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? You got to go to a pagan judge to work out a problem between 2 brothers? What kind of sense does that make? Makes no sense whatsoever, and that's what he's talking about. And then he goes on, and I think this is the secret. The foundation to this is verse 7, why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? It is so embarrassing for 2 brothers to go to legal. Just give in. Just give in. Sometimes it's better just to give in. It's not worth what's going on in this particular case. But he says, but you yourselves wrong and defraud, and he's going to talk about covetousness and greed a little bit later, even your own brothers. Now, I've seen this happen correctly. There are at least 2 instances in my life where legitimate disputes between brethren and the church worked it out, and it worked out well. Many years ago, I remember there was a franchise owner that was selling franchises, sold it to a franchisee in some other town, and there was a dispute about what was being provided or not provided in a franchise. I think it was a fitness franchise, a long time ago. This is 30 years ago. The elders from one congregation called the elders of the other congregation. They independently got some legal counsel, got the parties together and worked through it, and came up with an adequate solution, and nobody ever went to court. Now, that's the right way to carry things out. But I can tell you the secret to that is at the bottom of this, which is every party needs to hear what Paul says. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? Here's the way you think about that. So here's the situation. And this person thinks they're owed $25,000. This person thinks they shouldn't pay $25,000. Now, the way this conversation begins is each party is willing to give in. I'll give you the $25,000. You keep the $25,000. That's where this begins. If brothers start at the right place, right there, I'll give in 100% completely. And then they work through it, they'll get to an answer that might be a little bit better for both of them. But if they begin with my rights, the American way, right? My rights, I'm going to sue, I got to stand up for myself, I'll be nobody's doormat, and that kind of a mindset, you'll get nowhere. And so when you have brethren that understand this, and then come to a particular issue saying, my current position is I lose 100%. That's my current position. Now let's work through this best we can, right? I had another instance where, and this was in our congregation in Gold Hill, owner, small business, salesperson, both members of the church. There had been some kind of agreement on a commission plan. There was some vagueness in the document. I read it and thought, who wrote that? They've lost their mind. But we got to them and we said to the owner, you agree to pay this whole thing? Because this says, why not rather be defrauded? And then went to do you agree not to receive a thing? Because that's what that says. You lose completely. You start there, you can negotiate some things really well when you go. And we did. And they're brothers today and doing fine. So this can work. And maybe some of you have actually heard stories of this, but I've seen this work. Now, I've seen a few cases where they refused to do it, and that's sad as well. They're just completely ignoring the will of God. Comments or thoughts? Yes, sir.
Concerning saints and judge angels, I think the point here is the contrast that saints have without knowledge of eternity, judging those by contrast, the angels who fell with knowledge of eternity. And so, as he pointed out, Jesus also said that the people of Nineveh will rise against this generation and judge it because they responded to the preaching of Jonah, and you have one now in front of you who's greater than Jonah.
Right.
So I think contrast is the judgment.
I think that's right. He's talking about the fact that the judging angels and judging the world and eternity is it brings an eternal perspective to it. And so if Christians are doing the judging, whether it's with an eldership or whatever, you're going to have a completely different view. By the way, the story I told about the fitness one, the first one I mentioned, they talked to the lawyer. But they told the lawyer, now we're not going to follow the laws of the land. We want to know the legal principles that are involved here as an input to the decision, not the final arbiter. Because it may well have been that legally one of them was completely right. I don't know. I never kind of went through it. But it's this right here. We should understand, but we're going to judge it from an eternal perspective with a biblical perspective, not the legal questions that may be at stake. So, good comment. Gary.
Jesus said we live in the world, we're not to be part of the world. And it becomes very complex. You know, an older person slips and falls and breaks their head in the church building. And their insurance company says the only way you're going to do this is if you sue the church. And that's the only way you're going to get any benefit.
Yeah.
It becomes quite challenging at times for people. That doesn't mean that we don't.
Don't follow. Yeah. And I don't remember which state it is, but a Christian was in a car accident with another Christian. And it's one of those things that you couldn't get the insurance company to pay unless there was a suit. But they talked about it. They worked through it. And it was amicable between them. It's just the practical, technical things you had to do, which I think is your point. So, yeah. Yes, sir, Daryl?
The interesting thing, I think a lot of the comments, a lot of the statements is how we as parents raise your children. Don't let people walk on you. And that usually supersedes what the scriptures teach.
Yeah.
Don't tell them, go in bed, and those points, they do exactly the things that they were taught.
Well, so now you're getting to sort of the underlying principle that's here. And you can go to the Sermon on the Mount, walk the second mile. He who takes your coat, give him your cloak also. He who slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek unto him. The biblical mindset is to allow yourself to be defrauded. Now, I'm not talking about, physical lose your life things, okay? I believe in self-defense, because by the way, you love yourself as well and protect. I'm not talking about that. But most of our issues are not that. Most of our issues are circumstances where, well, he just did me wrong. He disrespected me, or any of these kinds of things that go on. And we tell people, and he mentioned our children, stand up for yourself. Well, there's another perspective on that, and that is we are in fact called to allow ourselves to be defrauded at times. And things will go better, especially between Christians, if we have that mindset, because we all have the same perspective that says eternity matters rather than the things of this life. And if we have that, we'll do much better. So, good point. Any other comments? Yes, sir.
If I may, I think we can also teach our children this principle in a different way. When two of our children, if you say in the youth group, get angry with one another,
Yeah.
it's not who's right or who's wrong. You go and apologize regardless of who's right or who's wrong.
Yeah.
And both of them do that. And that's the beginning of solving those problems.
I remember when I was a child, I was staying with my grandmother. I think I was running around her basement, and I turned and ran and hit a pole, and I smacked it. And she came up, now you come up and kiss that pole. It's trying to teach that non-retaliation, even towards inanimate objects, right? That's the same kind of thing. So, very good. All right. I think I'm going to stop there about 5 minutes early. We started 5 minutes early, and the next section, I'm going to be talking a while. I might go to preaching, so we better stop there. Appreciate your attention. Verse 9.